Testing 1, 2, 3. 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 Bloody hell. Testing 1, 2, 3. 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 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, I guess that's the best we can do. Alrighty. Welcome. This is Dis and Dat for 18 November. This is being recorded. Well, this is live streamed on 19 November, but this is the one for 18 November. We may do a 19 November later on today. Cultural economy and the creative field of the city plus cognitive capitalism. I needed to do this because, well, we just need to do this. It fits in the general problem of unpaid labor. It includes this question of intangible assets, which, covers an incredible range of things, including, what we're going to come up against. And that is, of course, the AI bubble, which will likely cause major havoc, at least in the north, the global north. So anyway, so we were going to begin with discussing general intellect. For Negri, the notion of general intellect identifies a general tendency of capitalism towards immateriality, that is, a tendency to become increasingly dependent on the intellectual and scientific energies that constitute labor. General intellect, according to Karl Marx in the Grundrisse, is capable of becoming a structural force of production. The concept designates a combination of technological expertise and social intellect, or general social knowledge. That is, the increasing importance, so this goes to the issue of the machinery, the fragment on machines chapter, increasing importance of machinery and social organization. This is the whole social relations thing writ large, structured in a variety of ways. It reappears as it becomes more, or as it organizes material machines. The general intellect passage in the fragment on machines says that while the development of machinery led to the oppression of workers under capitalism, and yes, it did, it often It also offers a prospect for future liberation. This is the whole business of advanced issues of relating to machinery, that is, computers, etc. So it's an opening on the one hand. On the other hand, it's a kind of closing. Cultural economy and the creative field of the city is an article by Alan Scott, A.J. Scott, from 2010. This is the abstract. I begin with a rough sketch of the incidents of the cultural economy in U.S. cities today. I then offer a brief review of some theoretical approaches to the question of creativity with special references to issues of social and geographical content. The city is a powerful fountainhead of creativity, and an attempt is made to show how this can be understood in terms of a series of localized field effects. The creative field of the city is broken down relative to the cultural economy into four major components, namely A, intra-urban webs of specialized and complementary producers, of which, Scott has written at great length about the industry, that is the media industry in Los Angeles. B, the local labor market, and the social networks that bind workers together in urban space. C, the wider urban environment, including various sites of memory, leisure, and social reproduction. And D, institutions of governance and collective action. I also briefly describe some of the path-dependent dynamics of the creative field. Now, that opens up a whole bunch of other things, which is, worth looking at, because of also the issue of path dependency, of course. The article ends with a reference to some issues of geographic scale. Here I argue that the urban is but one, albeit important, spatial articulation of an overall creative field whose extent is ultimately nothing less than global. Indeed. Now, as I think is the sort of relative standard to geographic materials, you can see kind of the distribution of activity. We have two major and then a series of middling centers. And there is a what you can describe not only as a function of population, but also as a location quotient. Now, these are very large measures, macro measures in that particular sense. Problematic, of course, is, what are these things actually measuring, and are they viable relative to getting us to, a much more critical analysis other than simply counting things. Cities with a high incident or aggregate employment in core cultural occupations of the United States, all cities shown have location quotient values of 1.75 or more. Now, the point, of course, is that on the one hand, these are locations. On the other hand, we have we have mass media network effects, which on the one hand are irrelevant relative to labor in these specific locations, but we need to get from there to what the larger kind of situation is, or how is, as a material object, how these things are situated in an economy. So that's kind of where we're at. This is the conclusion from Scott's article. The question of geographic scale notwithstanding, the emphasis in all of the above on specifically urban issues, the creative field that grows out of and undergirds the new economy is in practice stretched out at varying densities across the whole of geographic space. In other words, the creative field is a constellation of active ingredients necessarily has multiple scalar properties. Indeed. The urban, obviously, is one especially complex level. The national is another, notably in the guise of the triple helix, as identified by Ladesdorff and Etzkowitz of 1997. So is the global. Other spatial and organizational levels might also be distinguished as articulations of the creative field with identifiable emergent effects. Amian and Co. Hendet of 2004 and Zimi of 2004. In addition, creative impulses flow between levels and combine with one another in a diversity of ways. Baltet et al. Of 2004. All of these alternative dimensions of the creative field merit much further scrutiny, but the particular logic of learning, creativity, and innovation that now seems to be occurring at the global level has attracted special attention from scholars in recent years. New communications technologies occurred, bringing about major shifts in information flow processes. Not only is it becoming possible to transmit ever larger quantities of explicit knowledge over greater distances at decreasing cost, but much tacit knowledge as well. Explicit versus tacit knowledge. Some theorists, Lemur and Storper, 2001, Kaufman et al., 2003, have argued that the capacities of the internet are limited in this respect because it does not readily lend itself to ostensive interactions. This assessment is surely correct, as all things now stand. However, if the conjectures of Cohendet et al. 1999 and Fourier and Steinmuller of 2003 are on track, we can expect considerable relaxation of this limitation to occur in the future as the internet, in combination with embedded workstations, becomes more and more capable of handling information transfers of enormous complexity and subtlety. As this occurs, creative workers will undoubtedly tend to draw increasingly on far-flung, web-based communities for sources of inspiration, a phenomenon that is already well underway, according to Sunley et al., 2008, the British design sector. Concurrently, multinational corporations are now moving aggressively into all segments of the new cultural economy. And with the spread of their organizational webs across the globe, the creative field further extends its spatial reach. For the present, at least, the global and the local seem to encompass relatively distinctive sites of creative energy, even if they also swiftly evolving in the direction of increasing interpenetration with one another. In any case, it is important not to conflate current processes of globalization with the imminent deliquescence of the city. Yeah, as a center of learning, creativity, and innovation in its own right. Rather, globalization up to this point in time has been accompanied. I'm going to use that word deliquescence. I'd really like that. Rather, globalization up to this point in time has been accompanied by the emergence of an ever more differentiated global mosaic of cultural products, agglomerations, got to get that one in there, each endowed with its own idiosyncratic creative powers and assets. The thriving film and television industries of Mumbai, Beijing, Paris, London, Montreal, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Seoul, Bangkok, Mexico City, and other parts of the world offer striking evidence in favor of this claim. Despite the continued dominance of Hollywood in world markets, globalization, in short, does not yet appear, as in some extreme views, to be ushering in a world of cultural uniformity. On the contrary, it is actually being played out in terms of an increasingly polycentric and polyvocal geography of cultural production. A polyvocal geography of cultural, well, I guess because you're using the word deliquescence. The emergence of this simultaneously local and global creative economy raises many further questions about the ideological and political ramifications of cultural production in contemporary capitalism. That issue, however, calls for another article. Indeed. What's more amusing or interesting is, of course, the kinds of structures under which we could, if we were teaching, we could, show what is the relation between institutions of governance and collective action, local labor market structures and processes, core complementary craft, fashion, and design activities, and core sectors of the cultural economy, and then all the integrated elements that come from schematic representations of the creative field of the city. So yes, of course, it has neighborhoods, it has, other leisure activities, a visual landscape, social networks, tradition, norms, and sites of memory, which is, clear cultural geography thing, and of course, education and training activities. Now, what's more interesting, and as we'll see when we look at a more pointed view of this idea anyway, is, under flexible accumulation, we have both high tech, we have, weak capital labor compromise, mondialization of the market through globalization, internationalization of production, production of immaterial goods, privatization of the welfare system, to where we currently are, with, of course, what is at this moment in time is about precariousness and income polarization. We have the exploitation of codified knowledge, social productivity, investment in production of immaterial goods, capital gains that allow for that investment, and of course, financialization as the base, as it were, of that activity. So an interesting graph that we might consider in a much larger context in Fumagalli and Lucarelli's article on a model of cognitive capitalism, a preliminary analysis. So, a model of cognitive capitalism, a preliminary analysis. The aim of this paper is twofold. Firstly, we shall describe the main features of the accumulation paradigm that many scholars have not hesitated to name as cognitive capitalism, henceforth CC, and capital C, right? Which represents a variety of literatures, including Verisolone and Verisolone and Mouye Bouton, among others. Secondly, we shall attempt to provide a theoretical framework of it. And in section 4, we shall attempt to discuss stability and instability conditions of the model. CC, that is cognitive capitalism, is a form of accumulation without a viable mode of regulation, among entrepreneurs and workers about knowledge, exploitation, and capital gains allocation. And these two elements, knowledge exploitation and capital gains allocation, I would assert, and I think it's pretty clear that it's underserved in terms of political economy or economic geography approaches, and so we have a nice area in which to grow. On demand side, back to the text, on demand side, the increasing polarization of income distribution and absence of suitable welfare policies, we are now, the lack of universal basic income, poor support of health services, et cetera, risks to penalize not only aggregate demand, and that's the whole point of this, right? But even knowledge, learning process, and network economies. And as I have mentioned before, we're going to get a big challenge in terms of bubble economies and crisis and catastrophe, et cetera. An all too high share of precarious works can negatively affect social productivity with the risk to women risk to worsen financial gains. On the contrary, a constant realization, deliquescence. Anyway, on the demand side, the increasing polarization of income distribution in absence of suitable welfare policies risks to penalize not only aggregate demand, but even knowledge, learning, process, and network economies. A too high share of precarious work can negatively affect social productivity with the risk to worsen financial gains. On the contrary, a constant realization of capital gains and their fair allocation provided by financial markets should guarantee a stable growth of cognitive capitalism. Unfortunately, the recent history of financial markets, see 2007, 2008, shows their imperfections, such as those generated by asymmetric information, which lead to breakdowns in markets. Asymmetric information will lead to breakdowns in markets. Because instability of cognitive capitalism turns out to be structural, it is necessary to propose a viable economic policy able to contrast the instability generated by the present form of accumulation. Number 2, the peculiarity of knowledge and its spatial diffusion through the learning and the network processes are the basic features of cognitive capitalism. Under cognitive capitalism, the process of wealth creation is no long is no longer placed upon homogeneous and standardized scheme or schemata of labor organization. The productive activity is performed according to new organizational modalities. This is, where we're headed, right? Where net-shaped structures benefiting from the development of both linguistic and non-linguistic communicative commodities become predominant. As the most recent literature underlines, within a new growth regime driven by information and communication technology, knowledge has become the key variable for understanding the recent structural changes. Differently from the Fordist phase, the present diffusion of knowledge no longer depends merely upon technological transfers machinery, but rather upon relational flows generated by immaterial process. Relational flows generated by immaterial process. In this context, the hypothesis of decreasing returns of scale plays no role. This is Nelson and Romer, 1998. If, as we suspect, knowledge is the basis of accumulation, it becomes unavoidable to analyze how its exchange and diffusion affect the dynamics of productivity. Due to the fact that it is not exhausted by consumption, the cumulativeness of knowledge and the speed of its diffusion necessarily implies increasing returns of scale. The peculiarities of cognitive capitalism are its ability to enlarge both knowledge learning process, lambda, and network economies, kappa. The variable lambda depends on the degree of cumulativeness, opportunity, and appropriability. This is Nelson and Winter's term, 1982. Here, opportunity is defined as the expected rate of profit, P, and therefore, the higher the expected profit in adopting a new technology, the higher is speed of its diffusion. This is, there's a lot of literature on this. Cumulativeness and appropriability. Cumulativeness, appropriability represent the capacity of new knowledge to generate further innovation whilst avoiding the possibility of its limitation. The possibility of its imitation, avoiding the possibility of its imitation, thanks to the existence of IPR, intellectual property rights. Now, obviously, this is contestable and problematic, and engages the entire issue of the work of art, in the age of reproduction, etc. The variable kappa depends on the level of income, Y, and positive externalities, E. When lambda is constrained by IPR, intellectual property rights, the consequence is that the greater the degree of appropriability of knowledge, the smaller becomes its capacity of diffusion, affecting de facto its ability to generate positive effects on the associated productivity. Footnote 2. To a higher level of knowledge corresponds in terms of its generation, kappa, and diffusion, K, more innovative technologies. To a higher level of knowledge corresponds in terms of its generation, lambda, and diffusion, kappa, more innovative technologies. From a systematic perspective, an innovation is a change in the economic process caused by the investment activity. This depends on how much investment is devoted to the already existing technology or to new technologies, which is a big difference, actually. The crisis of Fordism led to a new investment activity based on new sources of growth, that is, electronic marketing, e-commerce, informational goods, encoding software, control over the quality of information, branding, control over the lifestyles, etc. Investment policies in a social system of innovation and production depend by the research and development strategies and the learning by doing process. In cognitive capitalism, the impact of ICT, information and communication technology based on computer science and microelectronics and the new productive organizations, that is, JIT, just in time, zero stock organization, which have been there since the post-war period, speed up the learning by doing process, spreading it out of the firm, period. Complementarily, part of the R&D, research and development process, is organized between the territories according to their competencies. The location of activities is mainly determined by the research of advantages in the development of firms' competencies, period. Mahood, 2006. Consequently, the productivity entailed by the exchange of knowledge cannot be assimilated to material productivity. Borrowing the so-called workerist approach, the operaismo, we shall refer to the social productivity of general intellect. See, we're already back. It's back there, right? Marx and the machinery. Footnote 3, in our context, general intellect is defined by the combination of dynamic learning economies, lambda, and dynamic network economies, kappa. In our context, general intellect is defined by the combination of dynamic learning economies, lambda dot, and dynamic network economies, k dot, whose intensity varies according to the distribution of both codified and tacit knowledge. In fact, can we, describe all the network economy in this way? Can general intellect be reduced to this system of terms? Under cognitive capitalism, the life cycle of knowledge comprises 3 phases, from tacit to codified to exploited codified knowledge. This is Fumangali, 2007. It is reasonable to assume that the greater the share of codified knowledge dedicated to the accumulation activity, the higher is the achievable level of social productivity. But when social productivity is subsumed to the accumulative needs of capital, the ill outcome, a negative outcome, is that the cooperation among those engaged in the economic activity does not allow each of them to contribute to the prosperity and management of the community itself. Orsi, 2006. It should be emphasized that there is a trade-off between the social productivity generated by general intellect and the tacit knowledge itself. Now, I think we need to, of course, break here and say, what is tacit knowledge? That general intellect is not identical to, and that tacit knowledge is a subset of general intellect, maybe not. Under cognitive capitalism, the origin of productivity gains is based on learning processes and network economies. Table 1 presents the virtuous circle generated by the interplay between investment and output by means of codified knowledge. So you can see some of the terms here. Y, operates to I in T1 to IT, and then K, Y, comma, E, lambda P, E, PC plus comma IPR minus, and then we get to a delta plus pi sub 1 and pi sub 1 or pi sub t, and this becomes y to the t, right? Y sub t. Now, this looks okay from a math point of view, but it, needs to be obviously broken out. So the realization of production is compensated by financial markets that act as the multiplier of aggregate demand. And you can see that there was, a demand thing there. The realization of production is compensated by financial markets that act as the multiplier of aggregate demand. And by the processes of globalization. That is, delocalization, outsourcing, lower labor costs is the essence of what globalization is, right? So financial markets, multiplier of aggregate demand, and the processes of globalization. The efficiency of the system is assured by both growth of financial markets, the primary source of surplus distribution, the growth of financial markets as the primary source of surplus distribution, and by massive process of outsourcing and delocalization characterizing advanced countries, which are by definition the places where the accumulation of knowledge occurs more intensely, noting, of course, their network effects, blah, blah, blah. In this context, the labor capital labor compromise based on the connection between productivity gains and real wage dynamics, is declining, connection declining, with subsequent effects on polarization of income distribution. In other words, the absence of a fair social compromise determines the instability of this finance-led growth regime. And if you may break here and say, in the current context, this is exactly the crisis, right? Fair social compromises are being traded off against stability of a growth regime that is led, indeed, by finance. Secondly, the income distribution that penalizes workers negatively affects learning and network economies. Consequently, the loss of productivity gains reduces the efficiency of the system. The high degree of precariousness, on the one hand, the degree of precariousness on the one hand represents the necessary precondition for perpetrating a situation of exploitation and command within the relationship between capital and labor. Gosh, we're already back to the 19th century again. On the other, it represents an obstacle to the development of knowledge. And if you wanted to break this out as a simple model, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and there's all kinds of other weird factors that go back not necessarily just simply 1 century, but perhaps all the way back to the damn Renaissance. In such a context, a new form of the capitalistic exploitation is the production of political lines in order to improve the financialization of social production. In this respect, now the financialization of social production has other conditions, right? Let me break out here in a second, debt, credit, blah, blah, blah. In this respect, exploitation in cognitive capitalism has been defined in such a context. The new form of capitalist exploitation is production of political lines in order to improve the financialization of social production. In this respect, exploitation in cognitive capitalism has been defined as the centralization, and the expropriation of the form and the product of social cooperation. That's a lot there. Seizure, centralization, expropriation of the form and product of social cooperation. So it gets seized, it gets centralized, and then it gets expropriated. The political sign of domination above and against the human valorization of the historical natural world, the command above and against productive social cooperation, the Negri, 1997. All this comes back. This is all very important. An enduring uncertainty deeply affects the learning process of the individual and his relational ability, with the result to reduce the impact of dynamic economies upon productive returns. Figure 1 describes the unstable circle of cognitive capitalism. So if we look at this is the unstable circle of cognitive capitalism. Now you can see this doesn't quite look like, Scott's sort of nice little centralized, locational, as it were, appearing cell-like construction of capitalism. Rather, it has a lot of other things going on, flexible accumulation, everything that has occurred since, globalization, blah, 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 blah. And we can see now technology, a weak compromise between capital and labor, and the market itself becoming globalized, internationalized, etc. And all of this is, of course, because of financialization. The privatization of the welfare system is built into financialization. That's where we are now. And of course, production of immaterial goods become very important. I mean, post-war period, certainly. And then, of course, the exploitation of codified knowledge. Now, that's a whole range of activity that moves, obviously from patents to law to, licensing to subscriptions to, all that kind of stuff. And which is connected to and conditioned on integrated with social productivity, and then of course the base, if you, as it were, which is not a base, but one could assert as a superstructure for this flexible accumulation, and that is capital gains and financialization, capital gains becoming investment, which relates obviously to production. Now, flexible accumulation is mainly based upon the globalization of financial markets. Now, we've discussed this before. This is, 2008, Michael Hudson, etc. Utilized by the investors both for financing the economic activity and for stimulating investments via the increased financialization of the productive activity, right? You need money to make stuff. Whilst the investments in production and transmission of knowledge, obviously the professional managerial class activities of education, training, research, development, management, that is immaterial goods increase. That is the production and transmission of knowledge increase. We assist to a significant reduction of the costs of codification, transmission, and acquisition of knowledge due to the generation and diffusion of linguistic and communicative technologies, ITC, the internet, etc. And yes, that's all there, right? It's right in front of us, right on your cell phone, whatever. Being independent form, space and time, not only knowledge, independent form, space and time, not only knowledge, has become an increasingly mobile resource, but also, and above all, codifiable. This is Rodriguez 2000, Riani 2004, and therefore exploitable by means of intellectual property regimes in a context within which the final goal is the exploitation of knowledge. The labor market becomes even more fragmented because a shift from mechanical repetitive to linguistic communicative technologies, that is high tech, irreversibly modifies both quality and modality of the performed work. It allows the exploitation of individual knowledge and relational skills, generates technological unemployment and work precariousness. Vis-a-vis the levels of remuneration, the process has led to the individualization of wages with a wage dynamics dislinked, dislinked, dislinked both form productive gains and working hours. And even more dislinked both form productive gains and working hours. God, need an editor. At the same time, as a result of the dismantling of the welfare system, increased quota of postponed salary are expropriated, favoring the growth of the quotas of income to be allocated, not to the people, but to the financial market. Now, this is kind of where we are right now in terms of, failed tax policy, et cetera, and, other BS like tariffs, et cetera. The actually prevailing tendency to privatize the welfare system embodies the irrelevance of the intervention of the state. Embodies the irrelevance of the intervention of the state in economy and the diminishing regulatory and distributive role of public function. It's exactly where we are right now. In the above framework, aggregate demand is influenced both by the dynamic of the financial markets and by the capital gains deriving from the internationalization of production. With the weakening of the wage productivity nexus, these dynamics had a greater impact on consumption and the investment activity. Weakening of the wage-productivity nexus, NEX, US. In a finance-led economy, in order to avoid a demand crisis, the wage regulation ought to be based, yes, it should be, based on the distribution of capital gains. However, firstly, in a context of precariousness, knowledge loses its generative capacity, given the widespread uncertainty. Secondly, as there is no guarantee that the overall produced wealth will be reinvested in the financial market or elsewhere. It could be hoarded, right? A finance-led growth is always at risk of instability. So, as far as supply side is concerned, changes in the ability to generate new knowledge as a basic condition for the spread of new technologies depend on the characteristics of the environment in which R&D activities are organized. This environment is positively affected by the income level and by a set of variables such as education, an overall macroeconomic and economic stability, a fair wealth redistribution, a balance between material and immaterial activities, and the existence of a good system of infrastructures, which we define as positive as opposed to negative externalities. Positive externalities. Number 3, the model. In our formalization, we shall follow the literature of the French Regulation School, Boyer, 2004, etc. On this respect, we shall highlight, firstly, the dynamic function of productivity as a key variable of the supply side, and secondly, the dynamic function of aggregate demand, composed of private consumption, increase in investment, and public expenditure as autonomous variables. Generation of knowledge in its spatial division and financialization affect open economies, including third world economies. But here, we have chosen to deal only with a pure case of the closed economy. Here, we have chosen to deal only with the pure case of the closed economy in which knowledge learning process, network economies, and financial dynamics develop entirely in the domestic arena. Obviously. I mean, it's just such a big deal or big problem. In such a context, we will clarify under which conditions productivity and aggregate demand dynamics are able to provide a stable rate of growth as opposed to an unstable rate of growth, which is kind of the risk at which the entire system operates at the current moment. The model is described by a linear differential equation system. Table 2, equations from 1 to 4, describe supply side dynamics based on productivity. It is supposed, as already shown, that this latter mainly depends on dynamic scale economies. So here you go. Network economies, K dot, are positively correlated to the level of production as proxy of the value of spatial diffusion of economic activities, and to externalities, capital E, supposed to be exogenous. Learning economies, lambda, as a positive function of investment activity and a negative function of exogenous intellectual property rights. Productivity changes is related also to changes in volume of output Y dot, as the so-called Verdorn law affirms. In the short run, an increase in output can determine a more efficient use of labor. Realizing static scale economies. Footnote 4. Finally, investment I is a primary source of productivity increases. It is composed by routine investment and by investment in innovation. Routine investment traditionally depends on demand expectation and on realized production level in the previous period. sigma capital Y dot. Investment in innovation is characterized by very high potential returns and at the same time by possible catastrophic losses. In presence of high degree of uncertainty, equity financing is much preferable. Indeed, beta, footnote 5. In cognitive capitalism, financing is the domain of the venture capital funds, life insurance companies, and investment funds. Footnote 6. Capital gains are supposed to be derived by the dynamics of systematic productivity gains, systemic productivity gains, pi dot. Footnote 7. We assume the existence of a single product. Thus, we do not distinguish between material and intangible goods in the investment equation, even though we know this is a fiction. However, the present version of the model cannot deal with this phenomenon. The second part of the model, from 5 to 8, describes the demand side in a very traditional Keynesian way. The aggregate demand is composed by consumption C sub N, investment I, and exogenous public expenditures G. So you have a productivity equation of pi dot AK dot B lambda dot plus CI plus DY dot, similar to Seelos-Labini and et cetera. And this includes other kinds of effects, et cetera. So consumption C sub N is supposed to be dependent on the local labor supposed to be dependent on the total labor income. Total labor income is not only intended as the wage mass, MASS, but even as the earnings from financial activities in cognitive capitalism. A share of capital gains is, in fact, distributed to some categories of worker, especially high-skilled ones. The effect is to induce a sort of, and this is an important deal here, one which is worth a lot of research, footnote 8, financial income multiplier. Now, all kinds of possibilities there, problematic, mathematical, blah, blah, blah. We could also consider the segmentation of labor market between stable and precarious work, all that gig economy stuff, right? By breaking down into two parts, equation 8. However, the present version of the model cannot deal with this phenomenon. Since this article is written, perhaps it has. One principal aim, spelling, what our principal aim is to represent the basic relations between cognitive variables and financial variables. Equilibrium is defined by the equality between the rate of growth of output and the rate of growth of demand. See Boyer 2004A, page 66. And so the cognitive capitalism model, a lot of equations, and worth sort of considering, from a modeling point of view. It has a supply and demand side. Now, when you consider this as from a modeling point of view, we learn, issues that how prices are derived, and then ultimately, in our little Marxian way, move to try and determine a kind of value index from that, which is the other sort of layered element of our modeling procedure, which we will define sometime later on. Now, he uses 2006 Agliata's it's the U.S. situation in the 90s shows the financial boom has a double result. From one side, the positive dynamics of shareholder values favors the increase in aggregate consumption. From the other, because of its unequal allocation, leads to a distorted income distribution. Then we can go all the way back and see whether Piketty makes any sense in that context. Now, the equilibrium equation 9, this one is useful and interesting because it has all these other little elements in it, and it's worth considering that because it has a parameter which denotes a constant dynamics of public expenditure, a rate of growth of labor income, a rate of growth of employment, a wage rate, a flat rate taxation, which, has its own other kind of issues. By simplifying and substituting where necessary, the system can be reduced by the two linear differential equation models 10 and 11, table 3. Productivity dynamics 10, the productivity dynamics of equation 10 is positively correlated to network economies and learning economies. Moreover, the impact on productivity depends on the value of the social productivity multiplier 1 over beta beta star. According to the level of propensity to invest based on financial capital gains, beta, and to the learning economy's effects on productivity itself, BH. The financial markets fix the financial markets fix the profitability norm in line with Boyer 2000. Cognitive capitalism can be considered a finance-led growth regime, but in our model, the first engine of the growth is the dynamic of social productivity. The social productivity is problematic on the one hand. On the other hand, it is exactly what the issue of social relations and a production model sort of are about, speaking in the conventional, Marxian terms. Stock exchange evaluation is the best macroeconomic indicator of this accumulation regime. Positive expectations on financial activities partially depend on the efficiency of knowledge generation and diffusion. That is, knowledge generation and diffusion is the combination or the sum of tacit and codified knowledge. According to the exploitation of learning and network economies, the exploited codified knowledge. Therefore, the impact of what we can call at the moment financial multiplier 1 over beta prime on productivity, 1 over beta star, on productivity is as much stronger as greater R, the impact of investment on learning economies, H, and the impact of the learning economies on productivity, B. For this reason, we prefer to define, and this is useful to see the transformation here, 1 over beta star as social productivity multiplier. So all kinds of other things going on here. If we assume that beta star is greater than 0, then the angular coefficient B, not beta, but B, capital B, of productivity line 10 is always positive. Yeah. The intercept, it could be negative, but anyway, the intercept of productivity line A, capital A, is positive only if lowercase a, capital E is greater than B, lowercase b, IPR. Result 1, as much higher is the negative impact of intellectual property rights on knowledge diffusion as lower is the positive effect of network economies on productivity. This all seems fairly logical. As a result, the generation of knowledge and its spatial diffusion through the learning process are the basic features of cognitive accumulation. So the generation of knowledge and its spatial diffusion through the learning process are the basic features of cognitive accumulation. This is, I think you can say, that the current move for the usual racist reasons, you could dress it up however you want, but minimizing or reducing the numbers of international students in the U.S. educational system is a disruption of knowledge generation and spatial diffusion. On the one hand, that's what it is from the American point of view, or the U.S. point of view, or the Northern point of view. On the other hand, it forces a different kind of move, and one that, obviously Canada is going to benefit from this, and Western Europe. will benefit from the quote unquote brain drain of this. And of course, only idiots would allow this to happen. And in fact, idiots are in charge. Anyway, as far as output line is concerned, equation 11, there is a positive correlation between demand and productivity if and only if beta plus alpha times 1 minus b, first order, is greater than alpha w. In order to discuss this condition, consider that, oh my God, oh my. Let me finish with result 1, and then we can look at the rest of this at some other moment. Alpha times 1 minus beta is the consumption level only based on share of capital gains, which is distributed to shareholders and to high-skilled workers according to individual bargains. So you can see there's already a differentiation, which is attended to, of course, in other literature. Alpha W is the traditional Keynesian demand of consumption goods based on wage rate. And of course, you know how complicated that can become. So we have that plus cognitive capitalism model in reduced form, which I think is useful because you can see that it begins to look like relatively conventional equations. And, so it has this Keynesian look to it, of course, but needless to say, the variables are ones that have post-Keynesian implications. And then the question of whether it's stable. And, a lot of this is going back to the original assumptions made by Boyer and asking a question about diffusion of Boyesian ideas, because needless to say, it's moderately complicated, or at least some would say that it's moderately complicated. Right. There's a section on that we may conclude with. And in fact, maybe we'll do that now because it does generalize. And so, yes, I did skip all that, but why bog you down with it's a relatively simple model, and it is Keynesian at its basis, but obviously the implication of it is one that has Minsky-like elements to it. So needless to say, we can talk about this at some other moment. So section 6, I'll conclude with concluding remarks by these two Italian folks. In cognitive capitalism, the accumulation is more and more based on political extortion of the product of social cooperation. It is the result of an increasing socialization of production in which firms valorize in a capitalistic sense, the wealth produced by social network activities. See, that summarizes, a lot of social media activity, or at least some ways in which we can configure it. In such a context, capital becomes productive of value. Capital becomes productive of value by the private appropriation of the quote unquote commons. You see, we're right back to the literature that we've been looking at before. Questions challenging under, for example, the rent. We were looking at rent versus the impingement of rent on the commons. Like tacit and codified knowledge, the commons is equivalent to, in this sentence, like tacit and codified knowledge. I like the idea that there's a difference between tacit knowledge and codified knowledge, because it gives us an additional way in which we don't have to privilege questions of knowledge in a kind of real sense if we're talking in a revolutionary context. Exploitation is therefore the production of an armory of instruments for the control of time of social cooperation. So note, we're not just simply looking at time as the abstract thing that we wanted to talk about relative to exploitation in production, but shifting it or articulating it or whatever as cooperation, amplifying it as cooperation. Capital is valorized by controlling the life cycle of knowledge So valorization, and this point in this sentence, capital is valorized by controlling the life cycle of knowledge, raises the this question of perishability and fungibility that we'll see in information problems. Financialization and increasing individual bargaining of labor may be considered as instruments of the domination against the social cooperation. And so what we can see here is that the conflict that in which we can equate certain sets of relations, the conditions of competition in that sense is domination and social cooperation. In the long run, aside from being dead, the exploitation of learning economies and network economies and the central role of precariousness and subalternity, this is north-south, right, which prevents a new form of wages regulation, push the system into a zone of structural instability. Welcome to Argentina and Brazil and a bunch of other places. Social productivity depends on two factors which are inversely correlated. On the one hand, there's capital's drive to extend the intellectual property regime in order to be able to appropriate knowledge, R&D outcomes, to appropriate knowledge, research and development outcomes via licensing and copywriting, right? That's the whole, LPE kind of argument. The effect of this is to limit the diffusion of knowledge, rendering it artificially scarce, which is the whole, antitrust kind of argument. On the other hand, there is capital's need to create a virtuous circle of the circulation of knowledges and information, and to increase their diffusion in order to accelerate the generation of new innovations and new knowledges, and the codification of hidden knowledges. And I think that's the key research point. The codification of hidden knowledges is an asymmetric element within this context, right? The implicit incompatibility between IPR and the diffusion of general intellect. So incompatibility between IPR and general intellect thus implies a trade-off which is currently unresolvable at the level of simple market exchange. It is. It just is. I mean, it's covered by a whole variety of other kind of elements, which is worth modeling theoretically. A high degree of IPR able to compensate the positive effects of externalities and learning process on productivity can lead to a decrease of the rate of growth of productivity and then of subsequently output. At the same time, from the demand side, a relevant role is played by the allocation procedure of capital gains generated in the financial markets as proxy valorization of social productivity increase, i.e., beta plus alpha times 1 minus beta in the model. Gee whiz. As it is shown in condition 14, equation 14, the dynamics of capital gains should be sufficiently higher. The dynamics of capital gains should be sufficiently higher to allow a positive effect on aggregate demand, but lower than the general impact on productivity generated by investment activity propensity. So that's, on the one hand, it's okay. On the other hand, other issues. In cognitive capitalism, as real wages are not indexed to productivity gains, as in the Fordist paradigm, this question of divergence or non-indexicality, I think, is worth studying. See Boyer, 2004a, pages 61 to 68. There is no fair compensation for the precariousness of the labor force. That's right where we are right now. In fact, the absence of a fair social compromise determines the instability of this finance-driven growth. A distribution of the productivity gains, beta, that penalizes workers negatively affects learning and network economies. Of course it does. We're doing it right now. You know, um, if you if you're pro-Palestine, you're in trouble or whatever. Anyway, consequently, the loss of productivity gains reduces the efficiency of the system. Yeah. The turnaround is largely the turnaround. This is important. It gets us right back to Marx again, is largely endogenous. That is, precariousness is correlated to decrease of network and learning economies, right? Of course, it seems logical. And the decrease of productivity and output. So, it's not tautological, needless to say, but it is endogenous in the fact that it is a dependent on this idea of turnaround, that is, turnaround in a writ large in the Marxian sense. A partial compensation of this drift may be a regulation in allocating capital gains among employers as substitution of the Fordist relation between wages and productivity gains. But this measure is not always assured. It cannot last, first of all, because capital gains dynamics is unstable and uncertain. And secondly, because capital gains allocation only to high-skilled workers, H1B, leads to a distortion of income distribution, which arise in as the degree of instability of the economic system. So you can see that there's a lot of math in here, and it's not so bad when it's sort of explained verbally. So I think we've, well, with all due respect, managed to get, without getting too bogged down in math, and I would hope that you wouldn't. But needless to say, we've looked at what counts as the work for the 18th of November. I've introduced a way of juxtaposing cultural economy with a much larger model represented by our Italians here of discussing the general intellect question, because of course the general intellect describes creation in a whole variety of different productive ways. So at the one level, we can consider creative effects, but also we see it within the context, and with all due respect to Scott's earlier work in flexible production, et cetera, and its association with neo-Ricardian, activity, it's all still connected. And the wine improves with age, even in new bottles. So anyway, we got to the end. I got to the end. You may not. But let me